Young bartender helps a wealthy black old man avoid a scam. Then he comes back to change her life. Before we share this incredible story of kindness and justice, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Let us know in the comments below, and let's begin. The cold was a living thing. It seeped through the window frames of the Haven, a diner clinging to life on a forgotten street corner, and laid its icy fingers on Alara's soul. Outside, a blizzard had swallowed the small town of Northwood whole, burying it in a silent, unforgiving white. The wind howled a mournful song, a soundtrack to the quiet desperation that had become Alara's constant companion. The diner was empty, as it had been for most of the past week. Each vacant stool, each gleaming but unused countertop, was a testament to her failure. She ran a damp cloth over the counter for the 10th time, the repetitive motion a small anchor in a sea of anxiety. Her hands, though young, were etched with the fine lines of ceaseless work. They were her mother's hands, she often thought, strong and capable, but they felt so terribly small against the mountain of debt her parents had left behind. The Haven had been their dream, a warm, bright place meant to be a sanctuary for the weary. Now, under her stewardship, it felt more like a mausoleum. The only light, a flickering neon sign outside that read, "The Haven," buzzed and stuttered, threatening to plunge her into the darkness that already filled her heart. The sign was a perfect metaphor for her hope. Fading, unreliable, and on the verge of extinguishing completely. A stack of envelopes sat by the cash register, a pale monument to her problems. Final notice. Overdue. Disconnection warning. Each word was a hammer blow against her resolve. She was 24 years old, an orphan since the car accident that had claimed her parents 3 years prior, and utterly alone. The townspeople were not unkind, but they were wrapped up in their own struggles. They saw a quiet, struggling girl trying to fill shoes too big for her, and they offered pity, but not patronage. Pity didn't pay the electric bill. Her gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the wall behind the bar. It was her parents, beaming, on the day they opened the Haven. Their arms were around each other, their faces full of a hope so pure and powerful it felt like a relic from another world. Alara touched the cool glass, her throat tightening. "I'm trying, Mama," she whispered to the silence. "I'm really trying, but trying wasn't enough." The truth, cold and sharp as the wind outside, was that she was going to lose this place. It was only a matter of time. The bell above the door, a cheerful little chime that had grown mocking in its silence, suddenly rang out, sharp and startling. Alara jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. 2 figures stamped snow from their boots in the doorway, framed against the swirling white outside. One was a younger man, dressed in a suit that looked too sharp and too thin for the weather. His face was a mask of impatient ambition. The other was an elderly black man, leaning heavily on a simple wooden cane. He wore a thick, well-loved overcoat and a gentle, slightly bewildered expression. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, scanned the empty diner with a quiet curiosity. It was the contrast between them that first put Alara on edge, the younger man's predatory energy and the older man's placid vulnerability. The younger man steered the elder to a booth, not with care, but with the firm grip of a handler. "Right here, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice a slick, practiced bomb. "Let's get these papers sorted so you can get back to your rest." Alara watched from behind the counter, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. This felt wrong. The air, already thick with her own anxieties, was now charged with a different kind of tension, a subtle conflict that had just walked in from the storm. Alara approached the table, her worn order pad in hand, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "Welcome to the Haven. Can I get you folks something warm?" Coffee's fresh, her voice was soft, a stark contrast to the howling wind. The younger man, Marcus, waved a dismissive hand. "Just water. We're here on business." He spread a sheaf of glossy documents across the table, their vibrant colors garish in the diner's dim light. The elderly man, Mr. Blackwood, squinted at them, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Now, as I was explaining," Marcus continued, his tone condescendingly patient, This is a portfolio diversification strategy. We're leveraging your less liquid real estate assets into a high-yield digital fund. The initial transfer is just a formality to secure your position before the market opens tomorrow. Alara began to pour 2 glasses of water, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't a financial expert, but she had learned the language of predators from the loan sharks and aggressive suppliers who had circled her after her parents' death. Words like leverage, formality, and high yield were red flags, especially when spoken with such urgency to an elderly man in the middle of a blizzard. She set the glasses down, her gaze lingering on Mr. Blackwood. He looked tired, the complex jargon washing over him. He picked up a pen, his hand trembling slightly. "It all sounds very fast," he murmured, his voice raspy with age. "Fast is good. Fast is profit," Marcus chirped, pushing the pen closer to the signature line. This was the moment of choice. Alara's mind screamed at her to turn away. She needed the business. Even 2 waters were better than an empty room. Making a scene could earn her a bad reputation. Finch, her landlord, was already looking for any excuse to be rid of her. Silence was survival. But then she looked at Mr. Blackwood's eyes. They were kind eyes, trusting eyes, and they reminded her of her father. Her father, who had always told her, "The only thing you truly own, Alara, is your character. Don't ever sell it cheap." Her conscience won. She cleared her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I couldn't help but overhear. Would you mind explaining that digital fund again? My grandfather lost his savings in something that sounded a lot like that." She invented the grandfather on the spot, a small shield of fiction to protect her. Marcus's head snapped up, his smile vanishing. "This is a private conversation." "Of course," Alara said, her tone relentlessly polite. "It's just, here at the Haven, we like to look out for our neighbors. This is a small town." She turned her full attention to the old man. "Sir, does he have a local office you can visit tomorrow, when the storm clears? It's always good to see a real brick-and-mortar building, don't you think?" Mr. Blackwood paused, the pen hovering over the paper. He looked from Marcus's tightening face to Alara's earnest one. The simple, practical question had pierced through the fog of financial jargon. Marcus's eyes narrowed into slits. "We're a modern firm. We don't have offices, we have platforms." He stood up, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "Now, if you'll go back to wiping your counter, we'd like to finish our business." Alara didn't flinch. She held his gaze. "I'm sure you would," she said softly. "But I just put on a pot of my mother's beef stew. It's hot and it's hearty. It's on the house. Why don't you 2 take a moment to warm up before signing anything so important?" She directed the offer to Mr. Blackwood, a lifeline disguised as hospitality. The spell was broken. Mr. Blackwood put the pen down. "The young lady is right," he said, his voice gaining a measure of strength. "It is cold, and I am hungry. I think the papers can wait." Marcus's face contorted with fury. He saw his commission slipping away. "This is a limited-time offer," he hissed. "Then perhaps it's not the right offer for me," Mr. Blackwood replied with quiet finality. Defeated, Marcus angrily stuffed the papers back into his briefcase. He shot Alara a look of pure venom. "You'll regret this," he snarled, before turning and storming out of the diner, the bell clanging violently behind him. The Haven fell silent once more, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was peaceful. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees feeling weak. She had done the right thing, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it had come at a cost. With Marcus gone, the tense atmosphere in the diner evaporated, leaving behind a fragile calm. Mr. Blackwood looked small in the oversized booth, the anger of the confrontation having drained the remaining energy from him. He watched Alara with an unreadable expression as she moved back behind the counter, her hands now trembling visibly. "That was a very brave thing you did, young lady," he said, his voice a low rumble. Alara just shook her head, busying herself by ladling a generous portion of the thick, fragrant beef stew into a bowl. She hadn't done it to be brave. She had done it because the alternative, watching him be taken advantage of, was unthinkable. It was a reflex, as natural to her as breathing, instilled by parents who believed that a person's worth was measured by how they treated others, especially the vulnerable. She brought the steaming bowl to his table, along with a basket of bread she'd baked that morning. The scent of rosemary and thyme filled the air, a comforting aroma that fought back against the cold. "It was nothing," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Please eat. You need to get your strength back." She offered the meal knowing full well it was one less she could afford for herself that week. The ingredients were a significant portion of her dwindling pantry, but the thought of charging him for it felt obscene. This was not a transaction. It was an act of sanctuary. He picked up his spoon and took a slow, deliberate taste. A genuine smile touched his lips for the first time. "This is wonderful," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It tastes like home." They sat in a companionable silence for a few moments, the only sounds the clinking of the spoon against the bowl and the ceaseless howl of the wind. Alara finally felt brave enough to sit in the chair opposite him. "He's done this before, hasn't he?" she asked softly. Mr. Blackwood nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Marcus is my grandnephew, my sister's boy. He sees me as an old fool with a checkbook. He's been trying to get me to sign over control of my investments for months. This was his most aggressive attempt yet." The admission hung in the air. He wasn't just a stranger, but a man being preyed upon by his own family. A fresh wave of sympathy washed over Alara. Loneliness, she knew, was a cold and isolating country. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Don't be," he replied, his gaze sharp and intelligent. He was looking at her, really looking, taking in the frayed cuffs of her sweater, the exhaustion under her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. "You have a good heart. A rare thing," he gestured around the diner. "This place, it has good bones. It feels loved." Tears pricked at Alara's eyes. "It was my parents' dream," she confessed, the words tumbling out. "They poured everything into it. After they passed, I tried to keep it going. But the debts, the town getting smaller, I don't know how much longer I can hold on." She hadn't meant to unburden herself, but his gentle demeanor felt like a key unlocking a door she had kept bolted for 3 years. He listened patiently, his expression never changing, simply absorbing her story of struggle and quiet grief. When she finished, he pushed his empty bowl away. "My wife, Eleanor," he began, his voice softening with memory. "She used to say that kindness is a currency that never loses its value. You can't put it in a bank, but it always pays dividends." He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He placed a crisp $100 bill on the table. Alara immediately pushed it back. "No, please. It was on the house. I couldn't." He gently slid it back toward her. "You didn't give me a meal," he said, his voice firm but kind. "You gave me clarity. You reminded an old man of the goodness in the world. That is worth far more than this. Please, allow me this." Reluctantly, she took the bill, the feel of it foreign and substantial in her palm. It was enough to cover the gas bill for another month. Tiny reprieve, a single drop of rain in a desert. He stood, leaning on his cane. "I must be going. I have a car waiting." He looked at her one last time, a strange intensity in his eyes. "Thank you, Alara." He knew her name. She hadn't told him. She must have a name tag on, she reasoned, though she couldn't remember pinning one to her sweater. Before she could ask, he turned and walked steadily to the door, pushing it open against the wind and disappearing into the white swirl of the storm, leaving Alara alone once more, clutching the $100 bill like a holy relic. The momentary warmth of Mr. Blackwood's gratitude faded as the new day dawned, gray and grim. The blizzard hadn't broken. It had settled in, a hostile occupation of Northwood. The $100 bill, which had felt like a small miracle the night before, now seemed like a pittance against the tidal wave of her debt. It was a single sandbag against a flood. Just before noon, The bell on the door chimed, but it wasn't a customer. It was Mr. Finch, her landlord, a man who seemed to generate his own personal cold front. He was a small, weasel-faced man with eyes like chips of slate. He brushed imaginary snow from his thin shoulders, his gaze sweeping across the empty diner with undisguised contempt. "Still empty, I see," he said, his voice thin and reedy. It wasn't a question. A prime location like this going to waste. It's a tragedy. Alara's hands tightened on the counter. "It's the storm, Mr. Finch. No one's out." "Excuses," he sniffed, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. He slapped it down on the counter. It was an eviction notice. The words, printed in stark black ink, seemed to leap out at her. Final demand, vacate premises. 3 months behind, Alara, he said, a cruel little smile playing on his lips. "I've been patient. My generosity, however, has its limits." "I can get it," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I just need a little more time. Business will pick up when the snow clears." Finch laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Time is money. You have none of the first, which is why you owe me so much of the second." He tapped a manicured finger on the notice. "You have 48 hours to produce the full back rent. Every last cent. $4,250. If you don't, the locks will be changed by noon on Friday, and every piece of equipment in here." He gestured around the room. At the grill her father had loved, the booths her mother had reupholstered by hand, "will be seized as collateral." The air rushed out of Alara's lungs. For $1,000. She might as well have tried to conjure it from thin air. She had less than 200 in the bank. The 100 from Mr. Blackwood was already mentally earmarked for the utility bills. "That's impossible," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Then I suggest you start packing," Finch said, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. He clearly relished this moment, this exertion of power over her. He saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle to be removed, a prelude to him renting the space to some chain for triple the price. 48 hours, Alara. He turned and left, the bell chiming his departure. Alara stood frozen, the notice a toxic thing on her counter. The quiet desperation she had lived with for months had now crescendoed into a full-blown panic. The walls of the diner felt like they were closing in, the air growing thin and hard to breathe. She looked at her parents' photo, their smiling faces a cruel mockery of her current reality. She had not only failed to save their dream, she had dragged it into ruin. The flickering sign outside seemed to buzz in time with the frantic, terrified beating of her heart. The storm outside had a rival now, a storm of despair and hopelessness raging within her, and she was drowning in it. She was utterly, completely, and finally at the end of her rope. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of frantic, fruitless activity. Alara called the bank, begging for a small business loan, only to be politely but firmly rejected due to the diner's outstanding debts. She reached out to the few distant relatives she had, their voices a mixture of pity and helplessness. No one had that kind of money to spare. Each phone call was a fresh wave of humiliation, another door slamming shut in her face. The world had shrunk down to the size of her problem, and there was no way out. She sat in the dark, silent diner long after closing time, the eviction notice lying on the table like a death sentence. The blizzard continued its assault, muffling the world in a blanket of white noise. She felt a profound sense of failure, a hollowed-out grief that was deeper even than when her parents had died. Then, at least, she had the legacy of the haven to hold on to. Now, she was about to lose that too. Just as she was succumbing to the crushing weight of it all, a sharp knock echoed on the front door. Her first thought was that Finch had come back early. Her body tensed, preparing for another confrontation. But when she peered through the glass, she saw a figure she didn't recognize. A courier in a heavy-duty uniform, holding a small, flat package. Hesitantly, she opened the door a crack. "We're closed." "Package for Alara Vance," the man said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Signature required." Confused, She signed the digital pad he offered and took the package. It was light, wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address. She closed and locked the door, her curiosity a tiny spark in the darkness of her despair. She sat down in a booth and carefully tore it open. Inside, there was no money, no legal document, just a single old photograph, its edges softened with age. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of her parents, younger than she'd ever seen them, standing proudly in front of the Haven on its opening day. Her father had his arms slung around her mother's shoulders, and they were both grinning, their faces alight with the sheer, unadulterated joy of a dream realized. It was a different copy of the one on her wall, taken from a slightly different angle, more candid, more intimate. She turned it over. On the back, written in a beautiful, elegant script that was at once bold and refined, was a short message. Your father once gave a young man a hot meal and a second chance on a night just like this, when he had nothing to his name but the clothes on his back. That young man never forgot the kindness he was shown in this place. A kindness you clearly inherited. S.B. Alara stared at the initials, her mind racing. S.B. Silas Blackwood. Couldn't be. The frail, vulnerable old man from the night before? He knew her father. The story flooded her memory, one her father had told her years ago. A story about a young, down-on-his-luck traveler, caught in a winter storm, who had been given a free meal and $50 from the register to help him get to the next town where a job awaited. Her father had called it an investment in humanity. It was him. The young man from the story was Silas Blackwood. He hadn't just been a random old man. He was a piece of her family's history, a living embodiment of her father's philosophy. This realization sent a tremor through her. It wasn't a solution to her immediate problem. The photo couldn't pay the rent, but it was something more profound. It was a validation. It was a sign that the goodness her parents had put out into the world hadn't just vanished. It had echoed through the years, and last night, it had come back to her. A surge of strength, fierce and unexpected, coursed through her veins. She wasn't just fighting for a building. She was fighting for a legacy of kindness. Hope, which had been all but extinguished, was rekindled into a small, defiant flame. The deadline arrived with the cold, gray light of Friday morning. Alara had spent the night cleaning the diner, polishing the chrome until it gleamed, scrubbing the floors until they shone. If she was going to lose the Haven, she decided, she would lose it with dignity. She would hand it over not as a failed business, but as the cherished, loved place it was. She put on a fresh apron and stood behind the counter, her back straight, waiting for the end. Right at 10 o'clock, the door opened to admit Mr. Finch. He was not alone. Two large, grim-faced men in work overalls flanked him, one holding a toolbox, the other a new lock set. Finch's smile was triumphant. "Time's up, Alara," he announced, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I trust you have the funds." Alara met his gaze without wavering. "You know I don't." "A pity," he said, though his eyes danced with delight. He gestured to his men. "Go on, boys. Start with the front door." As they moved to obey, Finch turned back to Alara, leaning conspiratorially over the counter. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "it doesn't have to be a total loss for you. I've had an offer on the property. A big corporation. They're mostly interested in the liquor license. It's one of the oldest in the county, very valuable." He paused for effect. "They're willing to make you a cash offer. A small one, mind you, $5,000. Enough to pay me what you owe and walk away with a few bucks in your pocket. No debt, no eviction on your record. A clean break." Alara stared at him, the final, cruel test laid bare. He was offering her a way out, a path of least resistance. She could take the money, abandon the legacy, and let her parents' dream be bulldozed and replaced by some soulless, generic franchise bar. Or she could refuse, be thrown onto the street with nothing, and be saddled with a debt that would follow her for years. Logic, survival, and every rational instinct screamed at her to take the deal. She looked past Finch at the photo of her parents on the wall. She thought of the note from Silas Blackwood, a testament to an act of kindness that had spanned decades. She thought of her father's words. The only thing you truly own is your character. Her decision was instant and absolute. No, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with unshakable conviction. Finch blinked, taken aback. No, don't be a fool, girl. This is your only way out. The haven is not for sale, she said, her voice rising in strength. My parents' legacy is not for sale. You can take the building. You can take the equipment. You can't take what this place means. You can't have its soul. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of defiance, not defeat. She had made her choice. She had chosen integrity over survival, memory over money. It was, she thought, the most profound failure of her life, and yet, she had never felt stronger. Finch's face twisted into an ugly sneer of disbelief and anger. Have it your way, he spat. Get her out of here. One of the workmen took a hesitant step toward her, his expression apologetic. But before he could lay a hand on her, the sound of powerful engines filled the street outside. A sudden, brilliant light flooded the diner as the headlights of several vehicles cut through the morning gloom. Through the front windows, Alara saw a fleet of sleek, black cars pulling up to the curb, their tires crunching on the snow-packed road. They were impossibly clean, impossibly out of place in her forgotten corner of Northwood. The door to the lead car opened, and a figure emerged. It was Silas Blackwood. But this was not the frail, bewildered old man from the diner. He stood tall and straight, dressed in an impeccably tailored cashmere overcoat and a sharp suit. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by an aura of quiet, immense authority that seemed to command the very air around him. He was flanked by two people, a man and a woman, both carrying briefcases and radiating a similar air of calm, lethal competence. Mr. Finch and his men froze, staring in disbelief. Silas Blackwood walked calmly into the diner, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the freshly mopped floor. His eyes, clear and sharp, found Alara's. He gave her a small, reassuring nod before turning his full, undivided attention to the landlord. Gerald Finch, Silas said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried easily through the stunned silence. It was not a question. It was a pronouncement. I believe you are trespassing on my property. Finch sputtered, his face a comical mask of confusion and indignation. Your property? I own this building. I have the deed right here. He fumbled in his coat, his bravado rapidly crumbling under Silas's unwavering gaze. You own this building. The woman beside Silas corrected him smoothly, stepping forward. She opened her briefcase and produced a document with a flourish. As of 7 a.m. this morning, the title for this property, and indeed the entire block, was transferred to the Blackwood Foundation. Finch's jaw dropped. He stared at the document, then back at Silas, his mind refusing to process the information. The whole block? That's not possible. Oh, it's quite possible, Silas continued, his tone dangerously soft. When you own the bank that holds the commercial mortgages, transactions can be expedited rather efficiently. He took a slow step closer to Finch, whose face had turned a pasty white. I've also taken the liberty of purchasing your personal debts, Mr. Finch. All of them. It seems you run your own finances with the same predatory carelessness you inflict upon your tenants. My legal team is quite eager to review your business practices. I believe the term they used was forensic accounting. The second man stepped forward, handing a thick file to a stunned Finch. You will be hearing from our lawyers, he said, his voice flat and final. Humiliation and terror warred on Finch's face. He was no longer a predator. He was prey, caught in a trap far more sophisticated than any he had ever set. Without another word, he turned and practically fled from the diner, his two workmen scurrying after him like frightened rats. The bell on the door chimed their retreat, a sound that was, for the first time in years, purely triumphant. The diner was silent again, but this was a new kind of silence, one filled with awe and disbelief. Alara leaned against the counter, her legs threatening to give out. She stared at Silas Blackwood, this stranger who had transformed from a vulnerable old man into an angel of vengeance. He turned to her, and the powerful aura receded, replaced by the gentle kindness she remembered. He walked over to the counter and placed a hand over hers. It was warm and steady. "I told you kindness pays dividends," he said, his eyes soft. He gestured to the woman, who stepped forward and placed another document on the counter in front of Alara. It was the deed to the building. Her name was printed at the top in bold, clear letters. Alara Vance. "The haven is yours, Alara," Silas said gently. "Free and clear. No mortgage. No debts." Alara stared at the paper, the words swimming before her tear-filled eyes. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice a choked whisper. "Why?" "My father used to say that you can't repay a kindness," Silas explained, his voice thick with emotion. "You can only pay it forward. On a night much like this one, 40 years ago, your father saved my life. I was young, foolish, and running from my own mistakes. I had nothing. He gave me a meal, $50, and a piece of advice that set me on the right path. He invested in a human being. I built my entire life, my entire fortune, on the foundation of that single act of trust." He paused, looking around the worn but spotless diner. "I've been looking for him for years, to thank him. I was saddened to learn he and your mother had passed. But then I found you, and I saw that his spirit, his goodness, lived on in you. You offered a stranger shelter from a storm, both literal and figurative. You protected me at great personal risk, without any expectation of reward. You, Alara, are the dividend on your father's investment." The cascade had only just begun. Silas wasn't there just to save her. He was there to rebuild her. He led a stunned Alara to the door and gestured outside. A large construction truck was now pulling up behind the black cars. "We're not just saving the haven," he announced with a grand smile. "We're restoring it." Over the next few weeks, the diner was transformed. A team of the country's best architects and builders, all on the Blackwood Foundation's payroll, descended on the small building. They treated it not as a simple renovation, but as the restoration of a historic landmark. The worn-out plumbing and faulty wiring were replaced. The kitchen was outfitted with state-of-the-art equipment that made Alara weep with joy. The cracked linoleum floors were replaced with warm, polished hardwood. The rickety booths were reupholstered in rich, comfortable leather. But they were careful to preserve the diner's soul. The original counter was sanded and refinished to a beautiful gleam. Her parents' photograph was professionally restored and given a place of honor behind the bar. And the flickering neon sign? It was taken down, lovingly repaired with new transformers and brilliant tubes, and reinstalled. When it was lit for the first time, its warm, steady glow was a beacon of hope that could be seen from blocks away. Silas didn't stop there. He established an endowment in her parents' names, a fund that would cover all of the diner's operating costs, utilities, supplies, insurance, for the next decade. He hired a small, dedicated staff for her, a cheerful cook and 2 friendly waitresses, all paid well above the standard wage. Alara was given a generous salary, the first steady income she had ever known. Her financial anxieties, the constant, grinding weight that had defined her entire adult life, were not merely lifted. They were obliterated. She was finally free to do what she was meant to do. Not just survive, but serve. The story of what happened spread through Northwood like wildfire. It became the stuff of local legend. The tale of the quiet, hard-working girl who stood up to a bully for a stranger, who refused to sell her soul, and who was rewarded in a way that seemed to belong in a fairy tale. The townspeople, who had once offered only pity, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect. They had misjudged her, seeing only her struggle and not her strength. The grand reopening of the haven was an event unlike any the town had ever seen. The mayor was there. The local newspaper reporter, who had once written a small, sad article about the diner's impending closure, was now writing a front-page story hailing Alara as a local hero. The entire town seemed to turn out, packing the newly refurbished space, their chatter and laughter filling the rooms that had been silent for so long. Alara, dressed in a new, crisp apron, moved through the crowd, a radiant smile on her face. She was no longer the isolated, anxious girl hiding behind the counter. She was the heart of this place, the center of a community that had finally, fully embraced her. People who had been strangers a month ago now clapped her on the shoulder, shook her hand, and told her how proud her parents would be. Silas Blackwood sat in a corner booth, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. He had become a permanent fixture in her life, a grandfatherly figure who offered wisdom, support, and a steadying presence. He introduced her to others from his found family. The board of his foundation, a collection of brilliant, compassionate people from all walks of life, many of whom had stories similar to hers. They were artists, scientists, and community leaders he had supported over the years. They welcomed Alara into their fold without hesitation. For the first time since her parents' death, she was not alone. She had a family, a network of people who valued her not for what she did, but for who she was. The vindication was overwhelming, a warm, healing light that chased away the last shadows of her old life. She had been seen, truly seen, and her worth had been affirmed in the most public and powerful way imaginable. A year passed. The Haven, now officially renamed The Haven by Alara, was the vibrant, beating heart of Northwood. The warm light from its windows spilled onto the street every evening, a constant invitation to the hungry, the lonely, and the weary. It was more than a diner. It was a sanctuary, just as her parents had always intended. The neon sign glowed with a steady, unwavering warmth, a faithful beacon in the dark. Alara was no longer just the owner. She was a pillar of her community. With the financial freedom Silas had given her, she had started a pay-it-forward program. A small chalkboard by the entrance was covered in prepaid meal tickets, purchased by customers for anyone who couldn't afford to pay. No one in Northwood went hungry if they could make it to her door. She had taken the legacy of her father's kindness and multiplied it, sending ripples of compassion out into the world. One crisp autumn evening, the diner was buzzing with its usual cheerful energy. Alara moved behind the counter with a practiced, easy grace, pouring coffee, sharing a laugh with a regular, her face glowing with a contentment that seemed to emanate from her very soul. She was no longer weighed down by the past or terrified of the future. She lived fully in the present, in the warmth and light she had helped to create. Silas Blackwood sat in his usual booth in the corner, a cup of tea steaming in front of him. He wasn't reading or working. He was simply watching her, a look of immense pride on his face. He was her family now, her mentor, her greatest champion. Their bond, forged in a moment of shared vulnerability during a blizzard, had become the most stable and cherished relationship in her life. Catching his eye, Alara smiled and walked over to his table. "Everything okay, Silas?" "Everything," he said, his voice a happy rumble, "is perfect." She sat down opposite him, her hands resting on the smooth, polished wood of the table. She looked around the bustling room, at the happy faces of her friends and neighbors, at the warm glow of the lights, at the steady, reassuring presence of the man across from her. She thought back to that desperate night in the storm, to the moment she had chosen to speak up, a small, seemingly insignificant act that had cost her nothing and everything. It was a choice made not from a calculation of reward, but from the simple, unshakable conviction of her heart. That single act of integrity, a refusal to let goodness be defeated, hadn't just saved her. It had redeemed a part of her world. It proved that a single candle of compassion, lit in the darkest of nights, could indeed set a universe ablaze. It is in our most difficult moments, when we feel most alone and powerless, that our character is truly forged. A choice to be kind, to be brave, to stand for what is right even at great personal cost, is never a wasted gesture. It is an investment in humanity, a ripple sent out into the world that can return, when you least expect it, as a tidal wave of grace. If the story of hope and integrity resonated with you, Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more inspirational tales that celebrate the best of the human spirit.